Hi everybody! Update on the sweater, or the sweater vest. I have done both the front and back parts. I've done one armhole and I have one armhole and the collar left to do. I hope that it fits me, but even if it doesn't, well, no. If it doesn't look good, but it still fits me, I'll be happy because this is the first item of clothing I've crocheted for myself, which is very exciting. And then also, here's the blanket. I'm about 4 rows behind right now. Ooh, it doesn't even fit in the screen. Only blanket. Okay, guys, so we gotta talk about a book today. I read His Majesty's Dragon this past week, and I have some thoughts about it. It was published in 2006, and I'm a little surprised it didn't get bigger then, but not totally because I can see some issues. So, I don't plan to say any spoilers, so, if you haven't read this, you can still go read it and then come back, and tell me your thoughts after you read it, but here are mine. So, I think the concept of His Majesty's Dragon is really fun. I think having dragons in the military is super cool, and I think we need more of that. Okay. I appreciated the tone that it was written with, like the dialogue, the words chosen felt reasonably accurate to the time period, which was the 19th century, late 18th, early 19th. Yeah. So big props on that to Naomi for doing such a good job with that. She was also reasonably accurate historically as well, which is always nice, right? So I guess it is technically historical fiction. Although it's it's like historical fantasy. Is that a genre? I don't know. It was in the fantasy section, not the young adult fantasy section, and I'm a little surprised by that because it was totally clean. And here's my main problem with it. My main problem is the telling instead of showing, which contributed to a lack of proper characterization. Okay. So the main character, the first 2 chapters are great. The first 2 chapters are fantastic. They really get you. They got me super excited about it. But as you go, the characters start to feel more wooden, especially the protagonist, because you're in his mind most of the time, right? I think it's restricted third person. Yeah, I don't think he's saying I. I can't remember now. And the problem is he does actions. He acts, but instead of being shown how he feels during those actions, we're just told. And that contributes to that lack of characterization because I want to see him choosing certain actions because of how he feels, right? Not just told that that's how he feels, so he's going to do the action. So, that's my main problem with it. I think I will read the second one because I did enjoy the concept. But the other problem is there wasn't a clear point to the story. It seemed like the point was just to get on a dragon and go into battle, which they did. They did sort of 2/3 of the way through the book. So I just feel like they didn't hit that internal change point that made that book feel really satisfying. I know it's a longer series. I think there are 6, 7 books. Let me see. Okay, Naomi. Okay, I think it's the Temeraire series. How many? 9. alternate history fantasy is what it is. Okay. Yeah, I'll probably read the second book. I'll come back and I'll tell you guys what I thought about it, but I don't know. Also, let's see. I just started Period Power today. Loving it so far. What else have I been reading? I don't know. Let's read a LitHub article. I've been seeing a lot go by in my email, and I haven't read any of them. So I want to see what's happening on LitHub. Okay. LitHub. You'll have to excuse me if I'm not like as bouncy as usual. It's the middle of my workday, and I started filming because had a little malfunction with a recording I was watching, and so I'm waiting for it to get itself together. Oh, well, if I finish my tea, that might help. Get that caffeine in there. Midday slump, am I right? Apparently the midday slump is like mainly for women. And it's worse for people with ADHD. I don't know about other neurodivergent people. But anyway, fun fact. Okay. What Elizabeth Bishop and Marianne Moore learned from each other. That sounds fun. How Cell's complex choreography sustains and ends human life. I don't think we should read that. Marie Mutsuki Make on writing in times of sickness and health. Marriage plots are so last season. 8 novels about divorce. Michelle Cobb on why she loves audiobooks. 30 new books critics think you should read right now. What are the fun ones that I've been seeing going by? Let's read what Elizabeth Bishop and Marianne Moore learned from each other. Piggy, come here. Good boy. You saw that girl walk by twice already. You don't have to bark at her. You want to see the boy? Are you ready to see the boy? Here's the boy. Ta-da. Okay, here we go. Elizabeth Bishop was quite sure she was going to be late. She fidgeted on the train in from Vassar, took a book from her handbag, tried for a few minutes to read, and replaced it. She pulled out the notebook in which she had written her questions, a notebook she would keep all her life. She added to the list of things she might mention book on tattoo, and underlined the name of one of her favorite poets, Hopkins. At last she gave up and stared out the window. The landscape seemed a little ambiguous. Whether the trees were encouraging or daunting, she couldn't quite tell. Why would the landscape be encouraging her? Is this Narnia? Even the trees are on her side? No. As the train pulled in, she ran her fingers through her bushy hair, which her friend had recently described as looking like something to pack china in. How nice. How come none of my friends have said that to me? I want to pack china in my hair. And pulled her hat down upon it. She took up her gloves and her bag and walked out into Grand Central Terminal. It was 3 blocks from the station to the public library. As she passed a corner tobacconist, she was relieved to see from its clock that she was surprisingly, on time. She made her way between the great marble lions, up the rest of the stairs, through the heavy doors, and along the sweeping staircase, until at last she arrived at the right-hand bench outside the main reading room, and there, wearing a white shirt and tie, vaguely Bryn Mawr 1909, as Bishop recalled, was Marianne Moore. The meeting had been arranged by Fanny Borden, niece of the infamous Lizzie Borden. Fanny Borden was a librarian at Vassar and had known the whole Moore family a long time. When, having read every poem by Marianne Moore that she could track down, Elizabeth Bishop had asked at the college library how she might get a copy of Moore's book, Observations. The librarian had surprised her by having one, knowing Moore, and offering to arrange a meeting. I'm so jealous. Just that people would introduce her to an author that she loves. I haven't read a lot of Marianne Moore myself. Bishop was glad that she hadn't realized at the time that Borden had sent Moore a number of young women to whom Moore had decidedly not taken a fancy. Moore must, however, have had an intimation that Bishop would be different than these others, or she would have suggested her other favorite meeting place, the information booth at Grand Central Terminal, where conversation was nearly impossible and one could always make a quick getaway. "Do you mind not digging in the blanket?" "Thanks." Marianne Moore began to talk. "It seems to me," Bishop wrote in her essay on Moore, Efforts of Affection, "that Marianne talked to me steadily for the next 35 years, but of course that is nonsensical. I was living far from New York many of those years and saw her at long intervals. She must have been one of the world's greatest talkers, entertaining, enlightening, fascinating, and memorable. Her talk, like her poetry, was quite different from anyone else's in the world." Bishop was so absorbed by Moore's conversation that, when she went back to write about this first meeting, she couldn't remember if she'd told Moore about seeing 4 saints in 3 acts 2 weeks before, or what she'd said about Hopkins, or whether she'd mentioned tattoos then or later. She wished she'd kept a diary. That same spring of 1934, Marianne Moore was at work on her essay, Henry James as a Characteristic American. Moore might have told Bishop the story she had liked so much in James's memoir, and retold in her essay the story of Thackeray and the small Henry James, the coat with too many buttons, and his feeling somehow queer, a feeling of being an outsider with which Moore seems to have identified. "Bingley." "Good boy." Gotta give him a treat for behaving. Her close friends T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, and Wallace Stevens, her correspondents for decades, were staking out various American traditions of their own. Moore, who did not follow William James in thinking examples better than descriptions, cared to have Henry James for her American project. Elizabeth Bishop spent her early childhood in Canada and was often away from the United States. She was less invested in the difficulties of defining herself as an American. Bishop, though, was interested in what she called poetic psychology, particularly the innovations of Hopkins, who she felt had succeeded in the project outlined by the scholar M. W. Kroll of capturing in poetry not a thought, but a mind thinking. In her work toward this end, Bishop, too, claimed an inheritance from Henry James. That day, on the bench at the public library, Bishop talked a little bit herself. At the end of the meeting, she was visited by an inspiration and asked Moore if she'd like to go to the circus, not knowing that Marianne Moore never missed the circus. Her friends thought Bishop's account of this second meeting hilarious. Moore arrived with 2 large paper bags containing brown bread to feed the elephants. They were fond of brown bread, she explained. Bishop later wondered if they might not have liked white bread just as much, and if Marianne had been thinking of their health. Moore had a prized elephant hair bracelet that her brother had given her. A hair had fallen out. Her plan was that Bishop would give some of the bread to the adult elephants, thereby creating a distraction, while Moore went to feed the babies and got them to bend over so that she could cut a few hairs off their heads. What the frick? Okay. Bishop drew the attention of the guard with her offering for the larger elephants. They did turn out to like brown bread very much. And while they were all trumpeting and waving their trunks and fighting and beating one another away, Moore sawed away at the hairs on the babies' heads, returning victorious with enough to mend her bracelet. Shortly after this, Bishop wrote to a friend describing Miss Moore. They called each other Miss Moore and Miss Bishop for another 2 years. "I've seen her only twice, and I think I have enough anecdotes to meditate on for years." Poetry was from the beginning central to the relationship. Why, Bishop later wrote of the early revelations of Moore's work, had no one ever written about things in this clear and dazzling way before? For her part, Moore was writing to her brother that she and her mother liked Miss Bishop better than any of our friends, of the friends we have adopted and are not beating off, but my whole feeling of enthusiasm is tempered by her tendency to be late. Marianne Moore was never late. She wore 2 watches, to be sure. Why do 2 watches help more than 1? Is it in case one dies? You can just be like, oh, what time is it? Oh, also the same time. Okay. Moore lived with her mother, the redoubtable and devout Mrs. Moore, at 260 Cumberland Street in Brooklyn, and Bishop soon began taking the subway out to visit them together. Bishop was very often friends with women and their mothers. She had grown up motherless. Her own mother had been institutionalized when Bishop was 5, and Bishop had never seen her again. Why did I say that so cheerfully? Mrs. Bishop died in May of 1934, 2 months after Miss Bishop met Miss Moore. In high school and college, her friends called her Bishop and the Bishop, and when Marianne Moore proposed that they switched their given names, Bishop was relieved to finally have someone calling her Elizabeth. That's ironic, to be like, Bishop was relieved, not Elizabeth was relieved, not Miss Bishop, but Bishop was relieved. Okay. She was pleased by the way Moore did it, too. She came down very hard on the second syllable, Elizabeth. I liked this, especially as an exclamation when she was pretending to be shocked by something I had said. Bishop said Moore and her mother were what some people might call prudish. It would be kinder to say over-fastidious. Bishop had her own sense of privacy and didn't publish some of her love poems for women during her lifetime, but her poetry had a more robust sensuality. Marianne Moore was Bishop's earliest advocate and one of the most staunch, placing nearly all of her early poems for publication in magazines and writing an introduction for her work, one of remarkable understanding that appeared with Bishop's poems in an anthology of work by younger poets. In this introduction, Moore praised Bishop for her methodically oblique, intent way of working, and she stated the principles she could sense coming in Bishop's poems, though they weren't yet visible to too many other readers. One would rather give disguise than travesty emotion. Does that sentence make sense? One would rather disguise than travesty's a verb here. One would rather disguise than travesty emotion, give away a nice thing than sell it, dismember a garment of rich aesthetic construction than degrade it to the utilitarian offices of the boneyard. One notices the deferences and vigilances in Miss Bishop's writing, and the debt to Donne and to Gerard Hopkins. Elizabeth Bishop had what Sarah Orne Jewett had called a wide outlook on the world. She was unusual among her friends in writing poetry that attended in its method of conveying landscape, animals, and travel to the work of British poets and naturalists, and she had also a vivid sense of French surrealism and a growing interest in the writing of Latin America. Sounding more and more like I should be reading Bishop and Moore. Elizabeth. In the years after she first moved to New York, Bishop used to go to the public library every day, past the lions and the bench at which she'd first met Marianne Moore, and through to the reading room where she sat for hours upon hours. Reading was virtue and solace for Elizabeth Bishop. When she was reading, she knew she was doing her job. She went out to concerts with friends. She came to know Billie Holiday casually. She went one day to hear Gertrude Stein deliver her lecture on Portraits I Have Written and What I Think of Repetition, Whether It Exists or No. But mostly she read. Sitting at the library, she went through all the late novels of Henry James, and she read Charles Darwin, George Herbert, John Donne, and Sigmund Freud. She read herself into an education, and in this, too, she had a model in Marianne Moore. After they had been friends for 6 years, Bishop sent Moore a new poem, Roosters. At 4 o'clock, in the gun-metal blue dark, we hear the first crow of the first cock. Bishop described her roosters marking out maps like Rand McNally's, with glass-headed pins, oil golds, and copper greens, anthracite blues, alizarans. Marianne Moore and her mother were so upset by roosters that they stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning rewriting it, taking out everything that smacked of vulgarity, particularly a most objectionable reference to a water closet. Bishop kept the poem as she had written it, but she and Moore remained close friends, testament to how loyal and sure they both were. They shared a quality a little different than taste or erudition, something that was not quite tenacity or confidence. Despite many downcast moments, terrible anxieties, protracted illness, and, in Bishop's case, serious trouble with alcohol, each woman knew what she was looking for. Neither Bishop nor Moore ever broke with people, and both worked hard at friendship. They wrote several letters each day to friends nearby and half a world away for their entire lives, and they were constantly on the lookout for books and articles and films and art shows and seashells and details of landscape that might be of interest to their friends and particularly to each other. There were literally hundreds of letters between them, and they tried to include something special in each one. Dear Miss Bishop, what you say of Brittany and the blue nets in the circus seems like pure fairy tale. Bishop always invited Moore to things. Invitations were her gesture in the relationship. I wonder if you would care to go with me one afternoon this week to see Martin Johnson's moving picture Baboons. Now, no one has ever invited me to see a moving picture on baboons. Honestly, I'm offended at this point. I'm actually definitely not. I don't want to see baboons. I do not want to see baboons in real life. I do not want to see a movie about baboons. I would not enjoy it. They talked of books. Bishop wrote from Florida, "We have been reading Henry James' letters, the autobiographic ones, all week, a very good hot weather influence. I am particularly impressed with the war letters. And do you remember when he had shingles?" They admired each other's language. "Nicey nice is perfect. How accurate you are, Elizabeth. This is just how I have felt." Dear Marianne, in your Wallace Stevens review, your remarks on bravura and the general marine volume of statement have kept me in an almost hilarious state of good cheer. They borrowed phrases from each other, sometimes consciously, sometimes without realizing it. Bishop wrote in her essay on Moore, "Perhaps we are all magpies." I think there's a lot more to be said about that one sentence. Perhaps we are all magpies. Because, like, if you write, I think particularly, no, just if you write in general. I was going to say particularly if you're a poet, but I don't know if that's true. You do pick out little bits of wording that you like or phrases that you're a fan of and sort of treasure them up to either riff off of or use to describe something else, to reference in your own work. Oh, perhaps we are all magpies. The letters were among their most treasured possessions. Moore once wrote to their mutual friend Louise Crane, "I had a letter from Elizabeth a day or two ago, which I am thinking of having tattooed on me." That's a little bit funny if Marianne Moore and her mother were so scrupulous. What's the word she used? Oh, it's going to take me to scroll. I'm going to have to scroll up a long way to find that word. But if they're that picky about, like, inappropriate language, why would tattoos be okay? Why would jokes about tattoos be okay? They shared an interest in the faraway, though it was Bishop's method to go and live next to it for years and come to know it, while Moore preferred to stay at home and receive reports from various correspondents living and long gone, to sift her researches very thoroughly and to somehow intuit the characteristic qualities of the place. Bishop started going to Key West in 1936 and was there for many winters over the 15 years that followed. Moore imagined Key West as a kind of 10 Commandments in vegetable dye color printing. What does that mean? A kind of 10 Commandments in vegetable dye color printing. Bishop wrote back from Florida that it wasn't fair that Moore, sitting there in Brooklyn, should hit the Key West lighthouse right on the head. By way of news, Bishop sent observations and books of her poems, North and South, A Cold Spring, and Questions of Travel. Her poems documented landscape and people in a way that had something in common with the main stories of Sarah Orne Jewett. At one point, Bishop considered editing a new collection of Jewett's work. She had always loved the country of the pointed firs, but in the end she decided that she wouldn't do better than Willa Cather had. In all the correspondence between Bishop and Moore, there were no pauses or breaks, the only one being recorded inside a letter itself. It was after Marianne Moore's mother had died and Moore was suffering very badly. Bishop sent her most loving invitation to her friend. The opening line of her poem, Invitation to Miss Marianne Moore, leaned on Crane and Whitman in Pablo Neruda. "From Brooklyn, over the Brooklyn Bridge on this fine morning, please come flying." Bishop invited Moore to the public library, giving her the honorific, "For whom the agreeable lions lie in wait." Writing to Bishop after she had received a copy of the poem, Moore's salutation read, "Words fail me, Elizabeth." Elizabeth Bishop lived in Brazil for 14 years that were among the happiest and most productive in her life. Her lover in those years was Lota de Macedo Soares, an architect and a Brazilian aristocrat who eventually had a series of nervous breakdowns, but who, before that, was always building a house or a park for the city of Rio de Janeiro, and who, like Bishop, measured life in travel. The two women lived in a beautiful house on a hill outside the city. Clouds sometimes floated through the windows. Is that literal? Clouds sometimes floated through the windows? Because that is hecking awesome. And I want to live in a house where clouds float through the windows. From Florida and Brazil and her travels in Europe and Latin America, Bishop sent Moore a paper nautilus that became the subject of poem, grapefruits, alligator teeth, Mexican slippers, and her own translation of a book popular in Brazil, The Diary of a Brazilian Girl, Helena Morley, which charmed Moore as it had Bishop. Bishop also sent postcards of Argentina, descriptions of toucans, and unusual feathers. Some of these objects and images turned up in Bishop's paintings and collages, as well as in a couple of box assemblages reminiscent of the work of Joseph Cornell. Later, needing to separate a little from Macedo Suarez, Bishop also acquired her own house in Oro Preto. I probably pronounced that wrong. And this house, perhaps her favorite house of all, she named for her old friend, the Casa Marianne. She had 4 photographs of Marianne Moore hanging inside. Bishop used regularly to invite Moore to visit Brazil, but for many years Moore wouldn't leave her mother, and after her mother died, she was a bit old herself to make the trip. I have to pause because it's time for me to have my work meeting. I'll come back when I'm done, because I'm enjoying this. Hey guys, back again. It's been like 3 hours. No, more than that. It's been more than that. Anyway, back to wrap this up. There's just like 2 paragraphs left. I probably could have finished earlier. Okay. Elizabeth Bishop and Lota de Macedo Suarez sometimes got up in the morning and made what Bishop referred to as gallons of coffee. The cat strolled through, and the toucan, Uncle Sam, hopped around on the floor, and the 2 women settled down to read. They read Flannery O'Connor and Randall Jarrell's Pictures from an Institution and Donne and Keats. They read Coleridge's Letters, Octavio Paz, the Brazilian writer Machado de Assis, Henry James, and La Fontaine. There were times, Bishop wrote to a friend, when they read from 7 in the morning until they went to bed at 1. Oh my golly. Sounds like a dream. Sometimes reading, Bishop thought, I have to tell Marianne about this, and she made a little note, and a letter would start itself. 3 weeks later, at home in Brooklyn, Marianne Moore would find something of Brazil or of 19th century England in her mailbox. Silently commending Elizabeth for her diligence, she would tear the letter open impatiently. And that's it. It's an excerpt, or maybe not a slight adaptation, I don't know. Anyway, it's from A Chance Meeting, American Encounters by Rachel Cohen. Cool. Well, that really makes me want to read Elizabeth Bishop and Marianne Moore. But, I've been getting a lot of my books off Libby. I can't read poetry on Libby. Like, I've got to have the book to read poetry. But that's really pleasant. Well, I hope you guys got a good amount done on your works in progress, your whips. I'm going to end the video because it's like 8:30 at night now. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.